One of the greatest problems with the abiogenesis view, which is the scientific view for the origin of life, is that unfortunately we have not seen the whole process actually take place. But that's because the process would have taken millions of years to go from step 1 to step 1,000,000, or whatever it took for the life to actually organize itself. Now we're going to talk about these steps, and we're going to talk about the fact that even though we haven't seen all the steps, we have seen each of the individual steps take place in the lab, and we have enough evidence to support the fact that it's possible for you to go from step 1 to whatever step you have to go to finish the origin of life. So the thing about the origin of life, it is unlike the mystical accounts of the origin of life. It is not based on, things that can't be proven. Although it does sometimes sounds iffy, and it sounds like it is the scientists are believing in this because they may not have sufficient evidence. It is different from a belief system from supernatural forces or mystical epic stories of creation or the origin of life or intelligent design or any of these things which are based on beliefs with no facts whatsoever. The scientific explanation for the process of abiogenesis is based on natural processes. Processes which are explainable by physics, by chemistry, by biology, and logic, which can actually be tested in the laboratory. And though we have not seen all the steps take place from 0 to whatever, we have seen each of the steps one at a time, and we have also seen computer simulations running the steps at a higher speed, of course, ending up with the same results that we expected for it to happen in the abiogenesis theory of life. Now remember that we already discussed in a previous lecture series that you already can have the building blocks for life even without life. That the organic molecules necessary for life could have been generated in the early primordial earth without life. That you had this primordial soup, and we did experiments like the meteorite experiments and many variations of the meteorite experiments, including volcanic vent experiments and heated rock experiments that showed that it's not only possible to create complex monomers like amino acids and lipids, but you can also make complex string of macromolecules, and there are molecules which are self-replicating, which can be created spontaneously without the assistance of life, but only through natural processes. This means that when we start talking about the origin of life, I'm not going to take you from the beginning. I'm going to take you already for the point where we already have the building blocks. And remember, even if this couldn't have happened on Earth, the development of these building blocks, there's plenty of evidence from space that there are comets which have organic chemistry on them, so it could have come from outer space. One way or the other, we have building blocks in this primordial soup of the early Earth, and conditions are right for the formation of the abiogenic processes that we're going to be talking about in this video. But I also wanted to one more time re-emphasize the idea that just because abiogenesis hasn't been completely observed from 0 to whatever step, it doesn't mean that evolution is wrong, because abiogenesis and evolution are two separate things. And abiogenesis is a theory, not so much. Perhaps a hypothesis, but we're in the process of proving it. And although we have not seen the origin of life taking place, and we have never actually created life from scratch, it is only a matter of time before we do that. Because, by the way, by the time this video was recorded, we have already created our own cell. What do I mean by that? We got a cell, a bacteria cell, so it already had its cell membrane and some ribosomes, some proteins inside. But what we did is that we took out the DNA that was inside that cell, and we put the DNA that we wanted inside of that. But here's the key. This DNA that we put inside was not real DNA. It was DNA that we fabricated. We invented it. We generated the DNA on the computer and had machines fabricate the strands of DNA, and then we put that human-designed DNA inside of the cell, and then the cell started to act the way that we asked it for it to act. And not only did it survive, but it reproduced and made more copies of itself. We effectively created our own species of bacteria. And that's phenomenal. And if you did not know about this, this is something that has already been accomplished by the same scientist group that invented shotgun analysis of DNA sequences, which revolutionized the message of comparing the method of comparing DNA sequences. Science is making such big advances. It's only a matter of time until we can actually create the cell completely from scratch, so that nobody can argue that we have not yet created life. And what's going to happen to proponents of vitalism and mystical accounts of creation when we get to that point? Life is a sequence of chemical reactions and molecules put together in a complex way. And it's only a matter of time until we can prove that that's exactly the case. And that therefore the process of abiogenesis makes complete sense. Now, of course, the proponent of intelligent design is going to counter-argue and say that, if we create life, it's only going to prove creationism because life couldn't have come by itself. We had to create it. But remember, the logic of what I'm about to teach in abiogenesis makes sense. You didn't need somebody to put that in place. It just happened. And that's why we teach it in science, because it just makes sense. Now, remember also that spontaneous generation, which is the thing that the scientists really figured out in 1668, and Spallanzani also this in 1763, and then Pasteur disproved even further in 1854. Every science about 80 years apart from the other, but each of them proved that spontaneous generation was not a thing, and that life had to come from pre-existent life. This is a 200-year almost old piece of science that does not apply for the idea of abiogenesis. Because abiogenesis is not talking about life right now, it's talking about life in the beginning evolving. And you could argue, hold on a second, but if life could have evolved in the beginning, how come it's not evolving right now? How come we are never finding new life forms starting right now? First of all, who's to say there isn't any life form evolving right now? But how would you tell that it was just evolved unless you actually saw it happening? You would just see it and you'd be like, oh, a new bacteria has been discovered. But we didn't even know that it wasn't a new life form that evolved. Of course, if that's the case, you would see that the DNA is completely unique, most likely, and it had nothing to do with the life forms that exist today. So it would be like a new tree of life starting. So you perhaps would be able to tell it's a new kind of life, but the reason why that kind of life is probably not going to be around too much, and it's hard to find something like that today, is because any life form like that is going to be so primitive, so simple, that the current life forms are going to outcompete that life form and immediately delete it from the population. And that's why you can't go back to the beginning anymore. So see how that just doesn't make sense? Their argument just doesn't make sense. And spontaneous generation is not the same thing as abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is not talking about spontaneous generation of life. It's talking about physical, chemical, biological, natural process generation of life. It's not talking about life coming out of nowhere. It's talking about life coming through a specific process. We also talk about the idea that the probability of life forming of a simple cell, it is terribly small, and that the cells that they see them today are so complex that there is absolutely no way they could probably have evolved by chance alone. But remember, life did not have to start this complex. It was simpler, much simpler. It was just a simple protobiont in the beginning, and we talked about that in another lecture series. So you do not need to start as complex as life is today, which means the odds are not that small. And since you have millions of attempts in a long time for this to happen, in a lot of places around the universe, a lot of places on the earth, it is completely possible for life to have evolved. It's almost a certainty, because even though the numbers or chances are incredibly small, even for a simple life form, once you have a simple life form, it's not random anymore. Natural selection takes place and the process speeds up, and so you have the evolution of life taking place. It doesn't have to be complex at the beginning, and that's one of the major arguments about it. Another thing we have to talk about, remember that the Miller-Urey experiment and evidence from space biology show us that life could have evolved on Earth from the building blocks that are already there. But Miller and Urey did not set out to create life. So it is wrong to say that their experiment is wrong just because it didn't make life. They weren't trying to prove that life could be created in the lab. What they were trying to prove is that in the lab you could create spontaneously generation of organic molecules even at the absence of life. Not that you need that anyways, because space rocks are full of evidence of organic compounds. We have gotten meteorites from space full of amino acids. We have gotten comets. We just sent a Stardust mission to collect specimens from the tail of a comet, and it came back full of organic compounds, proving that the universe is full of organic chemistry even in the absence of life. You do not need life for organic chemistry, but you certainly can have organic chemistry without life, and therefore have the building blocks necessary for life, even if life is not around. Also, remember that the universe has had a great deal of time, of space, of complexity, and of environment conditions, of variety, in order for life to have to be generated. And so you're not talking about something that will happen like this. You're talking about something that took a very long time, which is exactly because of that we cannot observe it happening now, or just in a little pieces of time that we have been studying it, because it's a process that would have taken a very long time to take place. But that is based on physical and chemical principles that can be explained. And when you watch the next video and you learn about the actual origin of life, you will see that it just makes sense. But remember, the early Earth was full of the building blocks for this origin of life already, and if they didn't come from Earth itself through processes like the millennial race suggested, or by other processes that we talked about before, they could have also come from space. So one way or the other, the early Earths had the building blocks from life. So all you need now is to explain how you go from that to an actual living life form. And we're going to talk about that on the next video, and I'll see you guys then.